Я дуже радий вас бачити на цьому семінарі. Це вже наше 5-те засідання. Цей семінар ми почали в березні. Це спільний семінар, який організований програмою Яцика, Канадським інститутом українських студій та журналом «Україна Модерна». І цим разом нашою темою є новий випуск журналу «Україна Модерна», який присвячений революції 14-23 року. І я перш за все попрошу до слова головного редактора нашого видання «Україна Модерна», пані професор Гаґена Гринченко. Прошу, Гаґена.
Дуже дякую, пане Ярославе, за надане слово. Дорогі друзі, шановні колеги, я рада вітаю вас на презентації.
Dear colleagues, I'm happy to welcome you at this presentation of the 29th issue of Україна Модерна. This issue is dedicated to the Ukrainian Revolution. It was published in honor, in memoriam of Mark van Hagen. It's now the 4th issue since we've become a semi-annual periodical, and I'm happy to announce that it is dedicated to a very interesting topic and a very significant figure, Professor Mark van Hagen. This is our 3rd presentation that we are doing online. We're recording this, and this will be featured on the Україна Модерна website. And as Yaroslav has already said, this is a joint initiative for Україна Модерна and the book seminar led by the Jacek program. And I guess we should say more about this. I won't take more of your attention with this formal presentation, and I'm happy to give the floor now to Yaroslav Hrycak, who will head and moderate this presentation, tell you about the logic of this issue, and lead the presentation. So thank you, Helena. I would like to thank Helena as editor-in-chief and Oksana Dudko as our guest editor. So this issue is dedicated to the memory of Mark van Hagen. Tomorrow is the 2nd anniversary of his death. And perhaps we should start by giving him, by honoring him with a minute of silence.
Я дуже дякую вам. Зараз
Thank you.
хочу дати слово пану
Now
професору.
I would like to give the floor to Professor Frank Sis. This issue is not only dedicated to the memory of Mark van Hagen, who I think whose influence on our thinking of the Ukrainian Revolution has been paramount. It also includes an unfinished article by Mark, and Frank Sisson wrote the foreword. And I think the involvement, Mark's involvement in Ukrainian studies is Frank's achievement. And if I could ask Frank to say a few words.
A year now since we lost Mark, I think that there are few people in the field, not only of Ukrainian studies, but of Slavic East European studies, who left such a wide mark on so many fields of study, but above all, who had influence on so many people. And I think it was the great fortune of Ukrainian studies that Mark van Hagen developed into a Ukrainianist, as he would have seen it happen. And then as well, the field that he chose to study. That is the period from the beginning of the First World War through the period of the revolution into the 1920s. This was the period which he devoted much of the research later in his life to, and ultimately happened upon the work of Pavlo Hrystyuk, the documentary study of the Ukrainian Revolution, which in many ways he renewed. That is a work that had come out in 1920, at least was known generally outside of Ukraine, and after 1991 could be known in Ukraine as well, but to which many of us perhaps no longer cast an eye in trying to understand these events. And he brought that, I think, gave us a new vision. And we are very fortunate in the issue that we have just published that we have his introduction to Christiuk's English edition. Quite uniquely in this case, it will appear first in a Ukrainian translation of that introduction. Mark van Hagen had virtually finished the introduction. It was still reviewed by Professor Ola Andrievska and Professor Serhii Yakelchik. Mark van Hagen received their comments. So he agreed with most of them. He regrettably did not have the opportunity to redo that section. And we as editors have lightly added those most important materials to it. Now, he came to that study as, I think, and there are many obituaries that were written after his passing, but I think just to quickly review it and some of the things that I say in my preface to the introduction is that in many ways he was destined to this field. A father of German descent serving in the American Army, and a mother who was a Viennese met as a result of the Second World War, and raised two sons in a household where still a grandmother of old Viennese customs was part of their household, but also a household that was part of a military establishment. And I think it is one of the things we must remember is that Mark was not only a military historian, but deeply interested in military and study of the military and in training the military in historical and cultural affairs. And he was very active in that later in his life at Arizona State University. I think some may forget that his upbringing in a Catholic household also led him to Georgetown, and quite a deep interest in not only the Jesuit teaching there, but in the religious culture of Georgetown. And I think in later life, as he turned to Ukrainian topics, where religious figures, particularly in the events that we are describing now, play such an important role, that background was very important for him. I do not like to typify or characterize people as revisionists or totalitarianists or to the schools that broke up Soviet historiography, but it was clear that Mark belonged to a generation which had been influenced by revisionism, which had been influenced by the left. At times he saw himself as a person of the left, but as someone who studied the military, a field, let us say, much more developed by people of the right, it put him on a very different course. But the one thing that he would say in his development is that he was trained as a Russianist. Fortunately, someone who learned Polish in the course of his study at Indiana University, which opened him up to the non-Russian peoples of the empire. But he would have argued himself, and he does argue in his introduction, that the field was very late in taking into account the many peoples of the Russian Empire and those involved in both the First World War and the Revolution. He went through a period of what he called Ukrainianization, but he brought to it very broad concepts. His interest in federalism, deeply interested in Drahomanov, his one need to study colonialism and post-colonialism. All of these were part of what he saw as well as transnational history that could develop the field of Ukrainian studies and led to his journal article, Does Ukraine Have a History? Some were a little, let's say, discombobulated with that title being brought up. But within that, he showed the many which he saw Ukraine as a borderland, and at times as a part of Eurasia, something he and I didn't agree on, but as many ways that could bring people to the field of Ukrainian studies. But meanwhile, he was ever deepening his own knowledge of what we might call traditional Ukrainian studies through his work on the First World War. And of course, the First World War means that Ukraine in itself is transnational, divided among empires, and it was part of Mark's study. And then on to what he saw as the Ukrainian Revolution. He admitted, a person of immense honesty, that as a graduate student, he had never read Reshetar's book on the Ukrainian Revolution, that his group at Stanford didn't see that as terribly central to their studies. He came to read that later, valued it very highly, and integrated it deeply into his own research, into his own reconsidering of those who both wrote the source material on what is usually called the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, but also on judging the work of his colleagues in that field. And then finally, he turned to the massive text of Christiuk and saw within that generation of social revolutionaries, a group who had been ignored at times by those in Petrograd and those who then later studied them, but also a group which he thought as bringing much new in our study of issues such as colonialism or federalism and its ultimate failure in the Ukrainian case. In that introduction, you will find a discussion of both the major source works on the field, but also what various historians have written. And Mark gives a good discussion of what is lacking in much of the field, and he has tried to provide that within this quite lengthy text that he has left behind. Where we in Ukrainian studies will always be grateful is that he involved himself in so many organizations and activities, whether it be in establishing the Ukrainian program at Columbia, whether it be in his heading the International Association for Ukrainian Studies, whether his role as head of ACES played a role in bringing Ukraine into this field. And so I would say that our gratitude to him is as someone who came from the outside and became an insider, but always remembered that his passion and his goal should be to expand the field of Ukrainian studies, and above all, the field of how the First World War relates to the revolution. However, we will call this revolution from Russian Civil War to Ukrainian Vyzvolnye Zmagання, and it was the passion of Mark's later years in development as you follow his various works dealing with Ukraine in this period, but above all, more and more taking from the work of Christiuk. And so with that, I think we are fortunate to have had him among us, wish that he were still here, and are grateful that we could dedicate an issue of Україна Модерна to the topics that fascinated him. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, пане професоре.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to give the floor now to Oksana Dudko, who is guest editor of this issue. Thank you, Yaroslav. Hello, I hope you can all hear me well. I would like to thank, first of all, our authors, most of whom are with us today. Thank you for finding time. Also the editorial board and the participants. I've noticed that some joined a bit later, so in case you haven't noticed, we have the interpretation function, and you can choose whatever language you prefer. So those of you who need it, please make use of it. I'm very happy to have this issue. It's reached me. I'm very happy to hold a printed copy, not just have a digital copy. And I would like to say a few words about the basic idea behind this issue. First of all, really this issue is dedicated to Professor van Hagen, and as Professor Sisson has already mentioned this, but I would like to single out maybe perhaps 4 aspects that we took into account in selecting topics and in inviting authors, because we were very clear that this very broad, very important topic, it will not be possible for us to encompass all of the topics. So the 4 aspects that interested most of us were primarily, first of all, geography, looking at the Ukrainian Revolution in the broader spatial context, seeing it through the prism of interaction between Greater Ukraine and Galicia, but also take an even broader view in the context of Eastern Europe and the former Russian Empire and the new Bolshevik project. Likewise, as both the editors and Professor Sisson have already mentioned, another thing that was very important to us, as it had been important to Professor Гаґена, was the chronology. Perhaps to some of you, the chronology will be unusual because we start with the beginning of the First World War in 1914, and we finish in 1923. A third aspect of this issue that we tried to reflect in our text was an attempt to look beyond politics. We tried to include a text on social and cultural history, gender studies, and present perhaps new trends in the research of Ukrainian Revolution, both in Ukrainian historiography and the more global historiography. And fourthly, I hope we'll be able to talk about this aspect in more detail during our discussion, is that we were trying to look at the different groups and different actors. So look beyond the political milieu. We looked at various social groups to the extent that the extent of the issue, the space of the issue allowed us to do this. And we like to look at how the revolutionary process was seen on 3 levels, both on the upper level and on kind of middle level and on the level of administration, and then on the grassroots level or lower level. And so how did we do this? I would like to look at the structure of our issue here. We have several texts. Primarily, we have the classically sort of research and articles. There's 6 of them in the articles and in this issue, and I would like to thank there are others here. Another thing that I would like to point out is that we've translated the Mark van Hagen's foreword or introduction to the foreword of Pavlo Christiuk. And I would like to invite you to read this text, encourage you to read this text, and perhaps Professor Sisson's introductory remarks will help you better understand the publication of Professor van Hagen. Additionally, we have Professor van Hagen's thoughts on Christiuk's work. The issue is opened with the discussion forum, and in our discussion forum, we try to talk about the different graphical discussions around the Ukrainian Revolution. And our main goal here was to look at what's going on in Ukraine. What is the research of Ukrainian, the current state of the research of Ukrainian Revolution, the key themes and context, but also take a more global view. I'm very happy that we have with us in this discussion forum that we have 5 wonderful panelists who are also with us today here. Professor Oleg Natyuk, Professor Yaroslav Hryca, Professor Serhiy Pechik, Professor Hennady Kurlo, and Professor Mail Fowler. So possibly I'll ask you to join us in the discussion and tell us a little bit more about this forum. Additionally, we have the so-called digital archive, in which Dr. Ksenia Kiebrzyńska talks about which new digitized publications about the War and Revolution can be found through the University of Toronto and the system of and the university libraries. So for those who are studying the revolution, again, you're very encouraged. I encourage you to look at this article because it's very convenient to have access to these neatly digitized copies of documents at the time. A large segment of our issue is dedicated to reviews. We have 1 review article and 16 smaller reviews, and the books under review were selected not only by how interesting they were, but also in how they might broaden the views of the foci on the Ukrainian Revolution through various national groups, through various geographies that were part of this difficult and dramatic revolution process in Ukraine. I can talk a lot about this issue, but we have the authors and the panelists with us, so thank you for joining us. I think we'll talk more about this, about the approaches and the elements of this issue more later, but I wanted to thank you, to take this opportunity to thank you again. It's a great honor and a great intellectual adventure for me to be part of this issue. Thank you. Thank you, and we thank you, because this issue wouldn't happen. Wouldn't happen without you, so we're kind of tacitly applauding here. Now we will switch to our discussion, where we'll have three leading specialists on the history of revolution. This is Oksana Dudko, who we just heard, who is currently at the University of Saskatchewan. It's Mihail Fowler, who is at the University, Stetson University. And I also would like to point out that Mihail was an invited editor of a Slavic review dedicated to the Ukrainian Revolution, where Larissa Belous also participated. And our third participant is Professor Serhiy Yakelchuk, who obviously doesn't need further introduction, but I think he's working on a synthesis of Ukrainian Revolution. At least I hope that's the case. So welcome to all of you. And also we have almost all of the authors, most of the authors of this issue, including the reviewers. So I would suggest that we work the following way. I will ask questions, which will in many ways follow the panel discussion in our journal. I will ask them to address them to our different participants, but also I invite all of those present, all who are involved in the issue. You can join us at any time. You can join us in the discussion, both through answers or through additional questions. So I'll start by repeating the first question of our issue, and I will cite frankly Mark von Hagen and his famous article, "Does Ukraine have a history?" Well, we asked, does Ukraine have a revolution? And the general consensus seems to be that it does. But then the question is, well, what is the Ukrainian character? What are the dimensions that make it a Ukrainian revolution? What are the dimensions that we must discuss to reveal the specifically Ukrainian character? And perhaps we'll start with Oksana. Thank you. For many historians in Ukraine, the national project and the formation of the Ukrainian state are at the core of this concept of Ukrainian revolution. So the struggle for independence, attempts to create a Ukrainian state, and then this very long period of historiographical discussions, thinking about why this project failed.
Чим є для мене українська революція? Вона,
What is
напевно,
the Ukrainian revolution for me? Well, I think the definition would depend on, right now relies on research that I'm doing. And right now I'm working on Ukrainian Galician soldiers, part of the Austrian-Hungarian army, of the Ukrainian siege sharpshooters, siege riflemen. And many of the siege riflemen, they crossed the borders many times, and they were participants in this classical revolutionary process, or this state formation. And so revolution to me is an attempt to understand the interaction that was taking place in the post-imperial terrain after the collapse of two empires, and how the different dynamics and different revolutionary processes interacted. Because for all that, there have been thousands of publications on what the Ukrainian Revolution is and what attempts were made to form various states. It's still not entirely clear what is the connection between what was happening in the territory of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire and in the territory of the former Russian Empire. And so my question, particularly in working on this issue and in my work on my research, is how do Ukrainians who how did Ukrainians who were, in the process of trying to build their own state manage to involve different contexts, context of the former Russian Empire and the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so, in other words, we can't look at the Ukrainian Revolution just in the context of Russian Revolution, but we also can't look at it exclusively in the context of Western Ukraine and the Ukrainian struggle for independence. And so the attempt to understand this juxtaposition, amalgamation of these different processes, it's not really my answer to what is the Ukrainian Revolution, but it is my internal research question that I was trying to clarify in working on this issue as well. Thank you, Oksana. Same question for Mihail Fowler. What was the Ukrainian Revolution? What dimension would you say makes us able to say that it was a Ukrainian Revolution?
Discussion, and thank you to Oksana for inviting me to the forum. And I'll really, I think, summarize what I said in the forum, although maybe expanded a little bit, in that I think the question of what is the Ukrainian Revolution is problematic in terms of categories. What do we mean by Ukrainian Revolution? I think different scholars in slightly different fields, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it's Slavic studies, whether it's Russian East European studies, have different understandings of what that category includes and what it excludes. And I would agree with Oksana and the other panelists that in Ukraine, it's very much about making a nation, right? A political revolution, making a nation. But as someone from the outside and someone who does cultural history, I see much more going on. And I think one has to be careful with the category Ukrainian Revolution, that you're aware of what you're including and what you're excluding in that category. This was a time of radical transformation for everybody living in this region. And as Oksana just said, there's revolutions going on in multiple ways, in multiple modalities throughout this region. That's actually what makes it so interesting, right? It's not just one revolution. It's one idea of revolution for one group of people, another idea for another group of people, another idea for another group of people. I mean, I think we have to really understand that this is such an incredible time, right? The collapse of empires, a major war, right? And people felt like they had this possibility and momentum to fundamentally change their reality. But it's not just one reality. And so I think we need to be careful with the terms we use. What stories are we including and what stories are we excluding? And I used the figure in the forum of Mykola Kulish, who dreamed of a left-wing socialist Ukraine that was part of the Soviet project, right? Do we include him in that Ukrainian Revolution category? Would he include himself? I don't know, right? Those are things that I think about in my own work. But I do think as well that the term Ukrainian Revolution is really important as a way of decolonizing Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. I think many of my colleagues here would support me in saying that the field, at least in the West, ACES, is so Russia-focused and Russia-dominated. For so many students coming to university, Russian Revolution, right? You can spend a semester explain otherwise. It's still the Russian Revolution. It's still Russian avant-garde, right? It's still Russian modernism. And so I think this very intentional focus for scholars and professors and teachers on expanding that concept of revolution, expanding the view, is really important in order to decolonize the field, in order to bring these stories and the world of people who aren't included in the sort of overarching standard narrative, at least in the West and North America. So thank you. I could say more, but I won't.
Дякую дуже. Ми з Сергієм належимо більш-менш до вікової одної групи, принаймні.
Thank you. Me and Sergei are about the same age group. At least we caught the Soviet Union. We were still students, and we remember that it wasn't a revolution in Ukraine. It was the Great October na Ukrainie. So it was like a regional expression of the Great October, and then there was the opposite tendency of turning Ukrainian revolution into the national визвольні змагання, liberation front. I wonder who first used the term. I mean, at least Reshetar uses the term Ukrainian revolution, but I wonder if it existed earlier. But I think it's very important to have Sergei's view, because he's familiar with all three of the paradigms, the Soviet, the national, and more or less the one that he represents. Sergei, the floor is yours. Yeah, thank you, Slavko. Yes, the term Ukrainian Revolution appears during the liberation struggle, and it's not only used in Hristyuk's books, but also his other contemporaries use it. But my understanding of the Ukrainian Revolution is that, my understanding of it is to an extent a response to the remarks that Michał just made today. Because really, if we look at the state of our field, any proposal to stress the Ukrainian context and the importance of the Ukrainian context in some historical period will of course run into remarks saying, well, we have to look at what's being included, and that's entirely fair. But it can also be very convenient for some people in our field. Not people like Michał, no, but other specialists who would never want to recognize the significance of the Ukrainian factor. This is also the most convenient way to discuss, to say that in stressing the Ukrainian factor, you leave out so much of the revolution history, or Great October Revolution, or the Russian Revolution, as we now say, in the Civil War in Ukraine. So it seems to me that we should perhaps instead start by having the main Western narratives and stories recognize the Ukrainian factor as this counter-narrative, as this point that undermines the hegemonic nature. And of course, once we disrupt that hegemonic nature, then we can agree that we have to refresh our critical ideas about inclusivity and exclusivity. But at this stage, as Michał rightly said, it's a question of decolonization. And my suggestion, as far as the term Ukrainian Revolution is concerned, is that we have to understand the significance of the Ukrainian ethnic factor and the Ukrainian national movement in processes that were taking place in the Ukrainian lands, the Ukrainian territories at the time. So this process can be described in completely different terms. It can be described as the struggle between the Reds and the Whites, and many Russian historians usually think it that way. Oh, it's the Reds and the Whites, and then sure, there's some Ukrainian nationalists, some unclear third wheel. But if we look at this narrative closely, we will easily see that the contemporaries already believed that the reason for the fact that both the Reds and the Whites failed was their disregard for the Ukrainian factor. And we know Lenin himself recognized this in 1919, and he stressed that we have to at least declare a recognition for the rights of the Ukrainian language and the separate nature of the Ukrainian government, and kind of clothe the whole idea in the form of sovereignty without real sovereignty, because he understood that the many losses of the Red Army in Ukraine, and the need to being pushed from Kharkiv and back to Kursk, was precisely in the fact that the Reds couldn't find a common language, a consensus with the Ukrainian peasantry that had already been awoken by the Ukrainian revolutions. The same for the Whites. Towards the end of their struggle, already in Crimea during the Wrangel government, when Denikin was no longer heading the volunteer army, that they should have taken the side of Ukrainian autonomy, at least, if not more. And then, in the last minutes of the white regime in Crimea, that's when Levko Chekalenko went there with a delegation of Ukrainian members of the Ukrainian government to lead negotiations. And those negotiations were not possible because the whites can only recognize that this was a problem, but in their ideology, they can't reach an understanding with the Ukrainian movement. So there is this recognition, there is this very clear recognition already then among the contemporaries. And so I think we have to start with this recognition, even if we're talking about, for instance, an aspect that is not only limited to the Ukrainian Revolution, such as the events of the Donbass in 1919-1920, which became the reason for Stalin's important letter in his argument between Stalin and Trotsky as to what path the Red Army should take to the Don. And you can see the Ukrainian context right away, because it's not the Donbass. It's not the Donbass that is the subject of the struggle. It's also the southern part of the Donbass, where you have Makhno's troops. The Reds are counting on Makhno, and the Reds can say that, you know, the workers of Donbass support us, so we're going through Donbass, but what really happens is that, yes, Makhno will support them, and it actually happens that way. Not to mention the fact that the very idea of marching on the Don by the Red Army from the early months of the revolution has been used as a cause, as an excuse for armed incursion into Ukraine. That's their first excuse for why. That's their first why as to why they entered Ukraine. Well, it's because they need to get to the Don, and the Central Rada won't let them in. Whereas we know that really they were after Kyiv. But you see, the Ukrainian factor is very clearly recognized by the contemporaries on every side. You know, they can say more or less about it, but they know it's present. And so it seems to me that when we say that all these events are elements of the Ukrainian Revolution, we are extracting an interpretation from the depth of the sources that had been suppressed, that people were trying to expunge from the historical record. And this is another accomplishment of Mark van Hagen's, that he was looking at a period, you know, that in the historiography of the Russian history seemed to be a period of you know, broad support for the Bolsheviks, you know, those processes going on in the army. And he was the first one in the English-speaking world to have stressed the movement for the importance the importance of the movement for the Ukrainization of the army, and how Ukraine, that was kind of in the rear of the southwestern front, defined the political situation. So had the soldiers all supported the Bolsheviks, it would have created one context. Had the Second Guard Corps marched on Ukraine, but then they ran into Skoropadsky, that's a completely different context. This is now a meeting, a clash between two projects. And the thing is that Skoropadsky held that corps, held the movement of the guards to Kyiv. I think I've said a lot, so I'll take a pause now. Thank you, Serhiy. I would like to ask our authors, perhaps somebody would like to add or anything. We have Oleg Natyuk, I see Larissa Belarus. Would anybody like to add anything? Comment or, yes, Larissa? Could you turn on the microphone, please? Well, I would like to add from the point of view of my research, because I look at the Jewish sides of the history of the First World War and the Ukrainian Revolution. And when we talk about Ukraine or Ukrainians of the time, I'd like to point out, I would like to look at what precisely it is that is Ukraine and whom it includes and whom it doesn't really include. Because Ukraine is primarily a multi-ethnic territory. And when we talk about Ukraine and the Ukrainian Revolution, it's not necessarily about, you know, ethnic Ukrainians. It's also about other ethnicities, other nationalities that lived in these territories and had either similar or slightly different agendas. So they had their own hopes, their own ideas that didn't always correspond with the plans wanted. And so this, to a large extent, determined the results of what we now call the Ukrainian Revolution. It's great that we have the article by Thomas and also that Mark van Hagen mentions the aspect. He looks at what he calls the golden period of the Ukrainian Jewish relations, the 1917-1918, the national personal autonomy, and when Ukrainians and Jews were trying to build a common future in the Ukrainian state, and unfortunately, things didn't work out quite the way people had wanted, but there was great potential there. And so in looking at the Ukrainian Revolution, I think it's important to not just look at the history of Ukrainians of the period, but also look at the history of Poles, Jews, and even Russians as a national minority in the Ukrainian state. So, because I think it's important to understand their worldview and their perception of events taking place in the Ukrainian territories. And it might enrich our understanding of the Ukrainian Revolution and give us an idea of what to do with this variegated nature of these processes. Professor Oleg Natyuk, yes, thank you. I wanted to extend Larisa Bilou's remarks and point out that both Polish documents and Polish research, starting from the documents of the time of the late 1917, of the end of 1917, the recently published document, the notes and diary of Roman Knul, a later high-ranking official in the Polish Foreign Ministry, as well as studies, pretty old studies by Henryk Jabloński, dedicated to Polish autonomy in Ukraine, Polish national autonomy in Ukraine. All of this, it's really worth including these things in the main narrative of Ukrainian Revolution. As far as Roman Knoll's view, his note that he sent in December 1917, it's extremely notable, interesting in that Knoll stresses the separate nature of the Ukrainian Revolution vis-a-vis the Russian Revolution and its state-building, nation-forming potential. And so I think it's important to include this to a greater extent. And I was trying to say this in my remarks and in my thoughts in this issue. Thank you. Thank you. Would anybody else like to? Maybe we'll take another comment and then switch to the next question. Frank, sure.
So one issue we have to deal with is retrospective use of Ukrainian Revolution. So three quick cases. If until the First World War, Lipinski wrote about the Khmelnytskaya as a revolúcia, after the events that occurred between 1914 and 1920, he, in most cases, dropped those mentions. Revolúcia had, in his mind, been positive until 1914 and becomes negative after he sees what happens, particularly in Velika Ukraina or Berlin. Case two is Makhno, who of course writes the third volume of his memoirs using the term Ukrainskaya revolúcia, he writes it in Russian, and says in its masштабность, in its spirit, the Russian Revolution had become a Ukrainian revolution. But of course, as we know, he's really trying to appeal in the late 1920s to a Ukraine that now exists. It's totally out of context of what he actually thought in 1918 when he's writing about 1918. So I think that's a second of those. And then I think most difficult is the Nacionalna Revolucja that takes over in the 1930s. That is, revolution becomes co-opted by the right, radical right, and revolücja means and other things. But I think it's made the uses of Ukrainian revolution a particular quagmire for people to go through. Thank you.
Дуже дякую. Я хочу перейти до другого питання. Ну, перш за все, в цій дискусії...
Thank you. I would like to switch to the second question. First of all, in the discussion on the panel, I think we all agreed that the Ukrainian Revolution exists. And we were not even talking about Ukrainian Revolution, but Ukrainian revolutions plural. So, because there were many things that seemed the great distinctions between Ukrainian process and other processes. Now, as both Mayhill and Serhiy already mentioned, that it has strong decolonizing potential. The Ukrainian Revolution has strong decolonizing potential. But if we take a step away from these historical political questions, in your opinion, what did the Ukrainian Revolution bring to this context of East Central Europe? Let's imagine the revolution never happened. Suppose it never happened. What would East Central Europe look like then? You know, in order to best understand the character of this process. Maybe I'll start in the reverse order. I'll ask Serhiy to start answering this question, if possible. Sure, happily. Well, first of all, the Ukrainian Revolution has its own has a peculiarity in the Western Ukrainian National Republic in Zunr, where it might make more sense to talk about the national liberation struggle than to talk about it might make more sense to use the national liberation struggle than it would to use the term about the Eastern Ukraine. Now, this is happening in many ways, and the Ukrainian factor is important. But in order to understand the point and the result of this struggle, whereas in Galicia, they do have the character of this, similar to the Central European processes of national self-determination after the collapse or in the process of empires collapsing. And so we have to say that if there had been no Ukrainian revolution, then the civil war would have looked very different, much like the recent book by Johann Böhler talks about the civil war in Europe. So absence of Ukrainian revolution would have meant a centralized Russian state, obviously with some federalism. And in that case, it would have to have been differently inscribed in the history of the First World War, because the First World War is what determined the geopolitical context. But in that context of East Central Europe, the national factor of the Ukrainian Revolution is cast in even starker relief. It becomes even more important, even more obvious, because in this case, it might have affected the very definition of East Central Europe, or the self-determination of East Central Europe, because then the self-determination would have been against an undivided Russian project. But as it really happened from between 1920 and 1918, 1920, is that the Ukrainian Revolution was rewritten and presented to the world as part of this disorganized chaos, Bolshevik chaos taking place somewhere in the East, which precisely stressed the need for a strong state boundary around this Bolshevik space. And this aspect of doubt, this moment of doubt, of thinking about the numerous opportunities of the future, we see this a lot in the history of the Ukrainian Revolution, particularly when in the negotiations with the Triple Entente in 1920. And so on the one hand, the Entente says, yes, let's do it. And then says, no, this won't work. We have a different sense of what's happening a different vision, different understanding of what the East will be like. It's this argument between England and France about whether or not to support the non-Russian states in the Caucasus, for instance, or in the South. And then the decision that was essentially already made. You know, in Ukrainian sources, the French agents are telling them that, yeah, you have to coordinate with the white movement, which is of course not possible. And then, but this is the plan. We're going with this plan. So the possibilities of a different geopolitical decision have to do with how the First World War ends. And the fact that the Ukrainian Revolution metamorphosed, you know, underwent curious metamorphoses. We see this in the forces that Oksana Dudko is working with. So these switches from the Galician army, although they're not strictly, not only formal switches, although they're trying not to fight against the Ukrainians, but it's, you know, looking for some kind of internal foundation, you know, this group of conservative generals who refuse to fight against the Denikin. All these potential opportunities of the future, different possible futures, they're very clear in the example of the Ukrainian Galician army, or what would later happen to those Galicians. Or another great example is the Ukrainian artist Mykola Hlushchenko, whose works are now highly rated and very valued. You know, the historians know that he was a Soviet spy and that he knew Hitler and blah, 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 and got an album of watercolors from Hitler. Hlushchenko was involved in the revolution, but on the wrong side. He was with the Denikinites. And when the Ukrainian forces moved to right bank Ukraine, Hlushchenko retreated with the Denikin army. And so as a representative of the whites, he is a prisoner in Poland, and his inclusion in the artistic context of Europe starts from the white movement. So the revolutionary white movement. So this possibility is still there. It was present. And so I wonder what would have happened to Hlushchenko had there not been a Ukrainian project and no Soviet Ukraine as a response to this Ukrainian national project, and in what context we would see Hlushchenko today. And of course, historians too have to know that when he came back to Soviet Ukraine, it was as a staunch Stalinist, and he was writing denunciations for everyone, including his neighbors. So this potential for, you know, transmogrifying from the Denikin culture to Stalin is very clear. And I'll stop here. Same question for Mehul. Mehul, please.
Serhiy Kelchik, who gave us, I think, a great geopolitical story in his answer. And I don't do geopolitics, and I really don't do politics. So I want to give a cultural answer, which is that if it hadn't been for the Ukrainian Revolution, however we understand it, we wouldn't have had a. I work on theater, so I want to talk about theater and the arts and culture. And one of the things that I think I've discovered in my work is the incredible importance of people coming together and making art. And one thing that the war and revolutionary period facilitated was a lot of movement of people, and a lot of people with one set of artistic ideas, another group with another set of artistic ideas, and very rich and fruitful products coming from that. And I think the classic example of that is Les Kurbas, right? Coming from a very Habsburg context, going to the Russian Empire in this period that we're discussing, joined by a lot of artists from Галичина, who are working together with artists trained in the Russian Empire. And the result was extraordinary, right? And it wouldn't have happened if these people hadn't been moving around in this incredibly traumatic and transformative time. And I think actually that influence, to go the other way, from Галичина to the Soviet Union, to Soviet Ukraine, that influence is really interesting to me right now. What exactly was it that not only Kurbas, but also Sofia Fedortseva, Hanna Babievna, Eduard Bortnik, Ambrosi Buchma, Marian Krushelnitsky, what exactly was it that they were bringing as artists from this very specific region? What was it that they were bringing to their work with Kurbas? Was it particular ways of, some ideas, right? It was sort of a way of thinking about text, a way of thinking about how text and design work together, a way of thinking about how one expresses psychology. But the point is, they had one context and it joined another context, and the result was very productive. And I think that actually when we look on the micro level of theater people and artists, we see a lot of back and forth. And we see people from Soviet Ukraine going back to Poland, people from Poland going to Soviet Ukraine. And I think our ability to really unpack exactly what happened to people in this region, right, without getting swept up by these larger categories, allows us to see so much movement, so much mobility, so much circulation, and so much cultural exchange, which created a lot of this great art. And I think the larger, one of the important things in my career, right, is trying to explain to the larger field the importance of this period of art in Soviet Ukraine, because it was different. And there's this larger understanding of Soviet culture and kind of the culture that's coming out of this early socialist period. And it's actually very place related when you really look at it. And a lot of the general scholarly understanding is very Moscow based. When you look at what's happening in Ukraine, it's actually different. These are different cultural products. They're coming from different cultural influences. They're coming from different people. They're different. It's a different, fascinating, extraordinary cultural explosion, and we have to take it as such. And I think there are other such explosions, right, in Tbilisi, as we see in Soviet Georgia, in other places. And I think kind of extracting that Ukrainian modernism, that Ukrainian experimental theater, experimental art from the larger category of Russian or Soviet allows us then to compare it more with what's happening in Eastern Europe. Right? Of course, those artists were completely aware of what's happening in Berlin and Warsaw, right? So we should be too, right? That was the world, their mental, artistic landscape that they had, and we have to start understand that in order to really understand what made them create the artworks that they made. So I know I've gone a little broad in answer to your question, Yaroslav, but I hope it's interesting.
Дуже добра відповідь. Дякую дуже, Мейгл. Оксана, до вас те саме.
It's a great, thank you, Mehul. I would like to address the same question to Oksana. How might we imagine a Central and Eastern Europe without a Ukrainian revolution? Well, thank you for this question. I think I'll probably continue slightly differently, but like to continue what Mehul started. Quick answer, one sentence answer is that the Ukrainian revolution makes everything very complex. All of the categories to think that there's a Russian revolution that ends with the border of the Russian Empire, and then there's a different process in Eastern Europe, and we have these two processes. Well, Ukraine says no. Actually, it's a bit more complicated. Actually, it's a large territory on the border on the fault line of two empires, two collapsed empires, and the Ukrainian example kind of undermines, problematizes this, kind of pulls into question, well, where does the Russian Revolution end, and where do all these other dynamic processes begin? And it shows that it's complicated. There are many factors that we have to take into account. And so if we look at the Ukrainian Revolution and leave this narrowly political process, we will see this very hybrid, as Professor von Гаґена wrote, we'll see this very hybrid variety of various ideas. It wasn't the struggle with, nationalism or Bolshevism. It was a much more complex process that created many hybrid forms, where with nationalism overriding in some, or perhaps nationalism with elements of socialism, and then Bolshevism with elements of nationalism. So Ukraine is a large territory. It lets us see the complexity, and also what Larissa Bielowus mentioned, this multi-ethnic space. And so when we have the idea of nationalism or Bolshevism in this multicultural context, multi-ethnic context, then the picture is all the more complex. And I think it's very important to move away from this view from above although generalizations are good too. But I think in order to generalize, it's very important to have these regional studies or microhistory. And I'm really grateful to the authors who wrote the reviews and articles and who pointed out in the issue. And this wasn't my idea. This was their idea that I'm simply articulating. But I think it's extremely important. And also I'd like to mention what Serhiy Yakovlevich mentioned, ZUNR, the Western Ukrainian National, because it's this kind of afterthought, this kind of weird wing of the Ukrainian Revolution. And it's very difficult because we always have this classic collection of the Ukrainian National Revolution and the ZUNR. And so what Ukraine gives you is that if you look at it and say, well, what if we look at them in concert? What if we look at them together? We look at it as like a transfer of ideas and people, people and ideas and goods. And then we have this very interesting picture that brings up many challenges for historians of Poland or the Baltics, or for historians who study Russia, the Russian Empire. And so I'll stop here, but I think for me, this is a very important question. I think that the authors of the issue will agree with me, at least partially with this. I would like to just very briefly say that I think you succeeded. You played, to summarize the role of this revolution, it complicates everything.
I'm a bit anxious participating in this discussion because I'm not a historian of Ukraine. But you mentioned ZUNR, you mentioned geopolitical situation, and well, yes, in my opinion, there were several revolutions in Ukraine by the end of World War I, directly after the war, several of them. And ZUNR is, to some extent, a separate category, because ZUNR was very similar to several tiny, small that appeared in 1918, 1919 in Eastern Europe, sometimes successfully, sometimes not unsuccessfully. So to speak, revolution at ZUNR belonged to Central Europe, to all those changes in Central Europe. And particularly, for instance, there was an uprising in Greater Poland, in the Poznan region, at the same time when ZUNR appeared. And a history of this uprising in former Prussian Poland and in Eastern Galicia is very, very similar to each other. I mean, these are twin brothers with big Poland and Ukraine behind them, reacting in a way that they didn't like, with a big enemy in front of them, with social revolution in the enemy's countries. So if you change the names of ethnic groups participating in both revolutions or both wars, this is very, very, very similar. And finally, talking about these similarities, here I'm a bit disappointed, I have to say. I mean, generally speaking, I should start with congratulations. This issue is a great success, great achievement, and a really, really important publication that will be used by generations of students, historians, etc. But I'm a bit disappointed with the Polish contribution, or with the Polish part here, because from the Polish point of view, what happened in Ukraine in 1918, 1919 was an earthquake from the Polish point of view. Here is a new, huge unit east of us. We have to deal with them. We have to think about them. This is a very important geopolitical change. And Gurney's article was, from my point of view, a bit too narrow, because he concentrated on those works written after '89, analyzing some of them, ignoring some of them as a matter of fact. But in the Polish memory, historical memory, this is a huge thing. Lviv, the conflict around Lviv and the war with ZUNR, and then the alliance with Kiev, Ukraine. I mean, this is such a big thing geopolitically and in terms of Polish tradition, that I would gladly see more on this, because from the Polish point of view, yes, this was a geopolitical, very important revolution, continued later in the 20s, 30s, etc., etc. So this is my modest addition to this discussion. Thank you.
Дуже дякую, це дуже важливо.
Мусимо другий том робити.
Прошу.
We have to do a second volume. We have to do a second issue. Так, це
Так само, як Україна.
Similarly, like Ukraine complicates everything. Ukrainian revolution complicates the entire revolution. The Zoomer revolution complicates the Ukrainian revolution, right? Maybe I'd like to ask Oleg to say a few words, because I think Oleg is the leading expert on Zoomer, and what he's trying to do is he's trying to synthesize the history of Zoomer with the history of the rest of the Ukrainian revolution. So Oleg, what is the important contribution of Zoomer or of the region in general to this revolution? Turn on your mic, please, if possible. Thank you, Yaroslav, for letting me speak. Of course, Zoomer is different, and it's hard to put it into the general flow of the Ukrainian revolution. It's even a paradox, because Ivan Lysak-Rudnitsky shows us, he makes an example of Zoomer. He says that it's the only example of a state order in the Ukrainian revolution is Zoomer, and he points out that the Zoomer authorities had full support of the population. Of course, he doesn't say it was the Ukrainian population, but it's important, because we can't say that the Ukrainian authorities, you know, whether of the Central Rada or of Skoropadsky, had enjoyed the support of the entire Ukrainian population. No, we can't say that, because we had different social groups and different interests. But paradoxically enough, Zoomer was perhaps the most successful example of state building. On the other hand, the leadership, the discourse, did their best to avoid the word revolution. The word revolution was taboo for the leadership of the Western Ukrainian National Republic. You know, that's what they say on the front. They say the siege riflemen, the Ukrainians coming in from Greater Ukraine, but the leadership of the Western Ukrainian National Republic, of Zoomer, wants to demonstrate that no, there's no revolution going on. It's clear. These are clear transformational processes without revolutionary movements, and it even got to a point where it's not widely known, but perhaps you remember the memoirs of Tsehelsky, and where he said that in 1918 he was walking in Radechy with Count Badany, and he said, you need the Poles, you need our gentry, because our landowners, because you don't have diplomats. We will be your diplomats. I thought this was a made-up story, but apparently this was true. This was a scandal, and that Count Badany supported the Ukrainian movement, and we have an entire series of memories when memoirs when Roman Perfetsky was moving around the Powiats, and they started supporting the Ukrainian side. Why? Because it wasn't revolutionary. There were no pogroms. There were no blunders of the landowners. There were no confiscations. The property was, you know, if the gentry had escaped or if the magnates had escaped, there would be commissions, and they would describe and they would lease out the property. So all of these events, all of these steps that were taken by this conservative leadership were used to show in the Paris Revolution that we are not Bolsheviks. You know, to reject the accusations of the Polish side that the Galician Ukrainians are Bolsheviks. And on the other hand, we might ask, what would have happened had all of the points of Woodrow Wilson had been upheld, who said that all of the peoples of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire have to form their own national states. And we know that even the Austrian government took this idea, and they were preparing a project of an Austrian federation. And it was the Galician leadership, the Galician parliamentarians, that they supported this. And so ultimately, that's why there were all of these insinuations after the Ukrainian state was pronounced, because it opened the door for joining the Austrian Federation. We know that the November uprising, you know, we call it different names, but we can't call it, I mean, it was a fairly bloodless uprising, that relied on certain local structures. It seemed that the Galician Ukrainians were most prepared for statehood, They had lawyers, they had administrators, they had experience of working in different structures. So, yeah, okay, they had been deputies of the Russian parliament, of the Galician Sejm, diet. They were trying to find common ground with ethnic and national minorities. And it wasn't just the Jews who became situational allies of Ukrainians, but also consensus with the Poles in the cities, because Ukrainians, in installing their authority, did not cancel the prerogatives and the power of the local councils. All of the local councils in the territories that had existed prior to the revolution, they continued working, which stabilized the situation in the cities. So, the city councils, they took care to see that it wasn't just the Germans, just the Jews, but also the Poles who would get their share of the provisions. And so, although the state building policies of the Western Ukrainian government, which were attempting to stabilize the situation and avoid kind of manifestations of revolution, it still sets it apart, because we don't really know, much like Woodrow Wilson said, every nation has the right to self-determination, and they singled out Poland, but they thought, well, Ukrainians felt, well, if the Czechs and the Slovaks can, why not we? And so even after the Western Ukrainian Republic had already been pronounced and they were moving towards a union with the Ukrainian National Republic, Petrushevich still said, well, we don't know what's going to happen in Paris. And so what's another aspect in which it was very important, the Zuner was very important, was that there was a high national morale, that the Eastern Ukrainian army also relied on, right? The siege riflemen were one of the most combat-ready units. And so, and yeah, we saw that Galicians were not really seen as something good. They were attacked, and they were these are the English or whatever. The presence of the Galicians in Eastern Ukraine, ultimately, not just militarily, but also in terms of their communication with the peasants, played an important role in raising the national consciousness of the peasantry. In its initial stages, sure, but yeah. Another thing I'd like to say is, yes, we're talking about revolution, and Yaroslav will probably agree with this, but I'm preparing this publication. This is not a well-known figure, Mykola Bohun-Chudinov. I mean, he was famous in narrow circles of the time, but he thought that Ukrainians, unlike Lipinski, he said that Ukrainians should rely not on workers, they should rely on peasantry. And he created the Ukrainian Populist Party, and he worked in the south and the Kherson gubernia. But the waves of revolution forced him to emigrate. He wrote interesting memoirs, and I hope that we're going to publish it in a year. He had these notes of a Ukrainian counter-revolutionary. He was from Poltava region, and he was a member of the RUP party, the Radical Ukrainian Party. Later, he was a colleague of Petlura and Vinnichenko, but already during the Ukrainian Revolution, he joined the right-wing camp. And then he moved to Stanislav, and he was involved in creating the Ukrainian People's Party, which tried to find support among the Galicians. So he was a kind of a pro-unified Ukraine, but he was arrested by Petlura for his criticism of the Directoria policy. So there was an environment, a milieu that didn't like the leftist tendencies of Directoria. Well, I would like to add that, intellectual history is very interesting in that it allows us to look at certain things that are not clear to us otherwise. I think the fact that Russian revolution was a loss to the Bolsheviks. The revolution wasn't supposed to be Russian. It was supposed to be a world revolution. That was the idea of Marx and Lenin. Just Russia was supposed to start, but it wasn't supposed to end with Russia. So I think the role of the Ukraine revolution is that among other things, it was one of the things that the revolutions didn't spread to Hungary and Germany as victorious revolution, because at the time that the Bolsheviks were winning in Russia, there were also revolutions in Hungary and Germany. And had there not been a Ukraine, it's quite possible that the Bolsheviks might have swept that territory and joined the German movement or the Hungarian communists, and then the Bolshevik movement might have triumphed in a broader region. Of course, we had the miracle of the Vistula, but that was already after the German and the Hungarian communism were no longer really a factor. So the Ukrainian revolution plays another role here. Okay, we've been talking for quite a while and it's very interesting, but perhaps I will now switch to questions from the audience. I hand by Danilo Sudan. Do you have a question? Do you want to comment? No, I wanted to add, if possible, a quick remark on the sociological aspect of the revolution, because I think if we're looking at the history of ideas, it's an important factor that I don't see in. Okay, so maybe the problem is in 1919, Hrushevsky created the Ukrainian Sociological Institute, then the Ukrainian. And then Shapoval created another institute in 1924. And so we have this interesting situation where they both are SR. They're both SR, social revolutionaries, and they have similar programs. That it's this kind of social, sociological accompaniment of a socialist movement. So Hrushevsky creates an institution that is supposed to provide scholarly accompaniment to this revolution. And of course, the project ended. Hrushevsky goes back to Soviet Ukraine, but Shapoval continued it. And in interwar Czechoslovakia, we have several sociological institutions that didn't lead to any great results, also because of Czechoslovak policy and Soviet occupation. But the interesting thing is that the Russian sociologists did not do this. So Sorokin, for instance, and he was, involved as a revolutionary in Russia. But after he left Russia, Soviet Russia, he moved to the States and he worked on his academic career. So I think there's another important, unique feature of Ukrainian sociology. And maybe had it not been for the 30s and 40s, this would have changed. What would have changed Central Europe is the emergence of Ukrainian sociological institutions. So I mean, the first sociological institution in Germany took place in 1919. So it's not just that we're not falling behind. We're actually moving in step with time. But it's an interesting product. It's not a purely academic sociology. It's a politically engaged sociology while still trying to preserve its academic standing. I think it's an interesting thing that that we don't see in other sociologies, particularly in the Russian Empire. Although I'm not entirely sure, because apart from Sorokin, Timashev also immigrated to the States, and so they never got involved in the kind of further political struggle, unlike Ukrainian activists who were studying sociology, but at the same time were trying to, build Ukrainian causes and Ukrainian society. So this is this interesting phenomenon that I don't think is repeated elsewhere. It's something that came out of the revolution, because before that we had Tikivsky, who was looking more at human rights. So he had this kind of, he was more in the spirit of the kind of Russian intellectual discussion, whereas the Ukrainian revolution brought forth this hromadoznavstvo, sociology for communities, which of course ultimately failed, but there was this attempt. This is a very interesting observation, Danilo. I would like to, I see that among our participants or our listeners, we have questions and raised hands. Maria, I see Maria Menentyeva, you had raised your hand. Hello? Can you hear me? My camera doesn't work, but so a very interesting question, a very interesting discussion. Thank you for inviting me and for organizing this and the issue. It's
ви, доктор Грицак, ставите.
You said very interesting questions, and I'm thinking about my research, and I see that I too have to look, take a different view, look at a different angle at the topics that I study, and look at more deeply, because I'm researching liberalism in Ukraine, and I would like to say a few words about well, the fact that the Ukrainian revolution for me starts earlier, because I think that some intellectual strains were there. The thinking was there. And I see that as already part of the revolutionary movement in Ukraine, in Kyiv. But what I see in my research is that Ukrainians or Ukraine threw up questions to liberalism in Russia, or as Oksana Dudko said, they complicated the question of liberalism, right? I would like to add this comment, right? What did the Ukraine Revolution bring? It changed the standing of the Russian liberalism, and even raised the question, does such a thing even exist? Does Russian liberalism even exist? Because in my opinion, there were many liberalisms. And the case of Kyiv shows that liberalism in Ukraine was radically different, drastically different than the liberalism in St. Petersburg and in Russia. Thank you. Thank you. That's a very interesting observation. We have a question from Yaroslav Kovalchuk. I was asking, to what extent was the class question important for the Ukrainian Revolution compared to the national? What do we know about the use of this terminology among Ukrainian peasants and workers? This is a question to all of you, but perhaps somebody would like to start. The question is in the chat. Serhii, can I ask you to maybe say something? I think this is most up your alley. Well, the question of class category during the revolution is that subsequent historiography uses this category, and they have this kind of catch-22 going on, this problem that class analysis through a class viewpoint with no possibility of a different viewpoint, a different stance. And so much has been written about this in Soviet historiography, but from a previously delineated understanding of how the classes were supposed to act in the Ukrainian Revolution, which led to these kind of artificial labels like petite bourgeoisie, right, that didn't correspond to like the reality of the Ukrainian village. There was no sense of like what's petite bourgeoisie, right? All of the peasants are, from the point of view of the Soviets, they're all bourgeoisie by instinct, but this can differ in the time of revolutionary change. So when the time passed, when it wasn't important to look at classes through this class prism, and this catch-22 kind of went away, it seemed like we finally had the chance to look at these narratives of the time, narratives of identity through a different lens. And unfortunately, there's a book in English only about the least demonstrative gubernia in this regard, Mark's Baker book on Kharkiv. But of course, before we draw any conclusions about the Ukrainian Revolution, relying on the work of my colleague who now lives in Victoria, Marko, it's important to remember that the Kharkiv gubernia were the Bolsheviks' platform for every incursion into Ukraine. So it's not really a great example. It's these borderland structures. It's tied to Russian course. It's not typical. Not just that it's different from right bank, but it's actually hard. It's not representative of Eastern Ukraine, of left bank Ukraine. And so the documents that he uses in this book, they're also quite interesting. They show how the peasants trying to master political language and how they're trying to use this political language to their own ends and their own interests, with their ideas of community, harmata, and with their sense of justice, what is morally just. And it has nothing to do with class politics. It has to do with, in the present discourse, it can be expressed through religious terms or ideas about a decent life, and about people who are not decent because they leave behind this peasant world, this world of a peasant understanding of how, what is to be done in certain circumstances, how to live in certain circumstances. And another thing that I think was very interesting for me in this book was the fact that those who come back from the army, they became kind of the political core of the new definition of Ukrainian peasant identity in many ways, in different ways, both in terms of both during the Ukrainian governments and in Bolshevik times under the Bolsheviks. But usually these are the locals who had been in the army during the war and then came back, which also creates this very interesting question of the evolution of the Ukrainian peasant identity in the years of the First World War. And again, this leads me to the contribution of Mark von Hagens to our field. Of course, Mark's contribution has been great, but there was another question about the workers. Can we say anything about workers? Are there studies about what the workers represented or did at the time? Is this an open question, or does someone have something to say? I haven't looked into workers of Dnieprянщина, of Eastern Ukraine as such, but I've talked about revolution in the Donbass, and what I've read about the course of the revolution to Donbass completely upended my sense of the category of the workers as category. Of course, I teach a course of the history of Imperial Russia. I let my students read works that completely upend this idea of a clear class orientation, and they put on other concerns of the workers, particularly prior to 1905. And it seems that they're all dreaming to be, small property owners, come back to the village and buy land or open a workshop. But in the Donbass during the revolution, the interesting thing is that the workers define themselves in opposition not so much to the peasants as to the miners, which from a Soviet point of view and a class-oriented point of view is impossible. That makes no sense. It's this earthquake, as Professor Kova said. It's an absolute earthquake because the workers define themselves as in opposition to miners. So the miners are like this different lower category that are absolutely, prone to violence. By the way, Jan Khrushchev, when he became a worker in the Donbass, he saw the first Jewish pogrom perpetrated by the miners, whereas the workers who, there's a photograph of Jan Khrushchev who dressed in a more petit bourgeoisie style, they try to completely separate themselves from miners as a different culture. And the traditional, according to, in the study of the workers' movement in the Russian Empire, it's this very important hierarchy in the workers' class. It's extremely important for workers. It's important for them to say that I'm qualified labor, well-paid qualified labor, than to say, oh, I belong to a class of workers in general. The memoirs of the workers at the time show a contempt to those who had recently come from the village, although those who write those memoirs had only come from the village themselves, or perhaps some decade before that. So there's a whole world of different hierarchies of violence, of contempt, that has very little to do with the kind of traditional Soviet picture of class analysis. But sorry, this is a very kind of broad strokes picture. It's very interesting. Danilo Sudan added an important comment. If you could look at the chat. Yeah. Well, if this is relevant, because as a sociologist, I have my own interest here, but what I forgot to say, what I didn't have time to say, what I decided to say this now, because the works of Hristyuk is a project that was realized in the Ukrainian Sociological Institute. It was started by Hrushevsky. It was reviewed, by the way, by Mikita Shapoval. And when Shapoval created his Institute of Community Studies, it's as if he continued this Hrushevsky series, because it was the series was called Materials and Studies of the Ukrainian Revolution, and Shapoval published the first volume of a 4-volume publication by Suletitsky on the revolution on the Kuban. And we were talking about space and their understanding of the Ukrainian Revolution. So Hristyuk wrote about Eastern Ukraine. By the way, within this project, there was also a work on Galicia, right? But Lozinsky, I think. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, right. And suddenly Shapoval publishes Kuban as part of the Ukrainian Revolution. So as far as space, as far as geography is concerned, it's interesting that for Shapoval, Kuban is included in this Ukrainian Revolution, but it's a sociological project. So it's published as part of a within a sociological institution. And this tells me that revolutionary processes, maybe not immediately, but they have this, maybe not entirely analytical accompaniment, but there are attempts to conceptualize and understand what's going on. I would like to welcome Boris Kutzman. He wrote a very interesting work. Boris, we were talking about what would have happened had there not been a Ukrainian revolution. What would this space look like? Well, I'm sorry for being so late, but I unfortunately couldn't be with you from the start. But as to your question, could you repeat your question? Okay. What would East and Central Europe look like had there been no Ukrainian revolution?
There would be no Ukraine now.
I don't think I can give you a snippet on this right away. But would you like to say anything about your article, your essay, what it contributes to understanding the Ukrainian Revolution? Maybe I'll say in English.
What I hope that my contribution was to the history of the Ukrainian Revolution is that very often it is overlooked that that the national minorities in Ukraine took active part in the developments of the Ukrainian Revolution, and actually also in the state building and constitution building efforts of at least during the year 1917 and early 1918. And so that minorities basically are part of the Ukrainian constitutional history. And I think this is what I try to show with the focus on one of those minorities, which might be overlooked more often because the Russian population in Ukraine during the Ukrainian Revolution was only starting to perceive itself as a minority. They came from an imperial perception of what they were, and of course, I could not make any statements about the entire Russian-speaking population. But what we see is that some Russian activists took part or acknowledged the fact that they now were a national minority in this area, and also contributed to this state and constitution formation. But I think more research is needed, in particular on the Russian population during the Ukrainian Revolution as a population that made its way from an imperial nation to a minority population, and then actually in the 1920s their way back to an imperial nation. And I think this is what I was interested in showing in this paper.
Дуже дякую, дуже дякую. Ми вже працюємо годину і 40 хвилин майже. Ми ближимося до кінця, і я хотів би скористатися з того, що серед тих,
Thank you. We're approaching the end. We're working for about an hour and 40 minutes, and I would like to make use of the fact that we have among us scholars of Ukrainian Revolution. We have Ms. Anna Procek, who looked into the white movement. I think a very important work. This is a very good introduction by Mark von Hagen. Perhaps I would like to ask her, Anna, do you have any comments to any of the questions that we were discussing? Are you with us? I am not, I don't think we're getting through. I also see with us Mikhailo Hauchman, and I'm particularly pleased because he will be taking on the review editor of Ukraina Mодерна, and I would like to ask him whether perhaps, Mikhailo, do you have any additions or comments or questions for the discussion? I don't know if Mikhailo can hear us. We have a chat from Natalia Hanenko-Friesen. As you can see, she extends her congratulations. Mikhailo's with us. Mikhailo, can I ask you to say a few words?
Доброго вечора всім.
Good evening, everyone. I am sensing a paradox when I feel a paradoxical sense when people say, you know, the strengthening the narrative of the Ukrainian Revolution. I grew up in an independent Ukraine, and we were studying Ukrainian Revolution as a given. You know, and then it turns out that you have to strengthen or support the sense of Ukrainian revolution in the world. Now, of course, it's clear that it's a Ukrainian concept, but still it's an interesting paradox for me. I think we're having connection problems. I understand Mikhailo is in Russia at the moment. It's not political, but there might be connection. Panyana, I see, is with us. Might I ask that you add your remarks? I don't think we're connecting. Mikhailo, would you like to continue? No, that I said what I had to say, I think so. Okay, well, I think we are approaching the end of our discussion. I'd have a question, but I'm afraid if I ask this question, this will extend our discussion. Maybe let's turn to our participants, the main panelists. Are there questions they would like to ask each other? Is there anything else that you think is very important that we've omitted in our discussion? Meho?
I wish that we had discuss the third question that you sent out, which was about the question on pogroms and violence and how that changes not only our work, but sort of the larger concept of this period of violence in Europe. I think that's a really important question. And I just want to sort of throw out to the general audience, I wish that the arts scholars and the violence scholars could get together and do something, because I think there's a lot of undone work in that field. And I've just recently been reading Elisa Bemporad's and Eugene Avrutin's Pogroms, A Documentary History for one of the classes that I'm teaching. And it's a really wonderful collection of primary sources. And I'm so struck by how these sources are taking place precisely in the places where Kurbas and his troupe of wandering artists are performing. And I think that one of the specificities of this period, and I wrote about this in the forum, is this idea of the violence happening around and the ways that artists responded to that violence, and this question of embodiment and the question of what does it mean to perform these plays about violence as someone who has literally just seen violence around you. And I think that's a huge undiscovered topic in this period. And I think what's so interesting right now, if I just may say, there's so much interesting theater and arts happening dealing with the violence in Ukraine today and dealing with the war. And I wish we could actually look back in time and work more to figure out this nexus of culture and violence back in the period of the Ukrainian revolution. So that's just sort of a call to arms. And I wish that we could do that. And I wish we could have discussed this question more.
Дуже дякую вам. Я взагалі мав намір, знаєте, поговорити, як впливає.
Thank you. I had the intention to talk about, how the events of the last 30 events of Ukrainian history, which had gone through the three revolutions in its time. If we take the independence as a revolution, how that affects our understanding of the revolution of 1917. Is there time for me to say a few words? Sure. So I'd like to point out the white movement, to draw attention to the white movement. I think there's not enough attention that's been given to how the white movement worked in the days of Denikin, especially Alexeyev and later Denikin. And so how hard at work they were to destroy, particularly through their agencies that were closely working with the Triple Entente, how they were trying to destroy the name of the Ukrainian movement, of the Ukrainian revolution in their program. From the very start, I might add, even back when even back before they had close ties to Entente. So there was the address, kind of the first focus, or the main focus was Ukraine, even before they turned their attention to the Bolsheviks. So I'd like to stress that the white movement was formed not so much in response, not so much against the Bolsheviks. They minimized they dismissed their significance in Petrograd. It was a movement for the unification of Russia, right? One undivided Russia, indivisible Russia. And I think there's not enough attention being dedicated to that. I think it's precisely the white movement that was trying to preclude closer ties between Ukraine and the Entente. As it's been said, the white movement never agreed to a federation because it would run contrary to the idea of Russian unification. The more so that the political leadership of the white movement, they weren't, it wasn't the right movement, it was the liberals. Astropanina, they had Midukov in the early stages. These were Russian liberals who considered that once Russia is a liberal country, liberal state, sooner or later, the national minorities would demand more rights, and sooner or later they would all lead eventually strive for independence. Now that's important to point out and to pay attention, it's somewhat overlooked. I would also like to stress that it was the white movement that noted the combat readiness and the ability to fight of the Ukrainian Galician army. And it was the white movement that was trying to separate and to divide. And we see this in documents in California, how in the Hoover Institution, how they're trying to divide Galicians and Eastern Ukrainians. And I think this is very important to note. And I would particularly stress, particularly encourage the younger historians to look at the documents of the White Army. The situation changes radically once Denikin leaves and Wrangel shows up. But Wrangel is a monarchist. And for the monarchists, the federation was even preferable because once you have a strong center, you needn't fear that Russia would fall apart again. So I would encourage young scholars in Ukraine to pay more attention to the attempts of the white movement. As far as, once we mentioned chaos, who's talking about chaos? It's the white movement. Agents of the Entente, in their reports, they stress the organization of the Ukrainian army and how strong it is, how it's the strongest army in the territory of the former Russia. I think I've taken a lot of time, but I hope that younger historians will pay attention to this aspect of Ukrainian revolution and the Ukrainian liberation struggles. Thank you. And I think not only younger historians, but also older historians should pay attention to this. Recently, I read a work by Nazarsky, I think I'm right, I think I'm correct, of a Polish historian who was also writing about Belarus. And he was making similar conclusions to what you just said. Oksana Dudko, you raised your hand. We've been talking for a while, but I would like to just use the opportunity to articulate what had been said, and also this, what Mehel mentioned and you mentioned, violence and the white movement. Violence is part of this issue, and it's a very important topic in the study of the Ukrainian Revolution. It lets us transcend this narrow political and national. I think we had Tomasho Parol here. His article was dedicated to violence, particularly anti-Jewish violence and rape of Jewish women in the territory of Ukraine. Also, we have here Professor Oksana Kuzmenko, who writes about folklore. And I would like to point out this as well, because the folklore that we have about the revolution, it's a very productive topic in the study of violence and how this violence was performed, or how this violence was seen, or how people were suffering for this violence. And these ideas of violence are very different from what we see in political history of the revolution. I know we don't have time or opportunity to talk about this a lot, but if we have any listeners still, I would like to point out these two articles, draw your attention to these two articles, and then a number of reviews that have to do with the topic of violence, because I think that even though we didn't talk about it here, it's one of the key subjects that needs to be studied. Thank you. That's a very important remark, and I personally think that violence is a central category that has to be studied as far as Ukraine is concerned in general, but the Ukrainian Revolution in particular. And it's interesting that I think there's good news that the Ukrainian-German Historians Commission it seems that we've received a grant to create a center for the study of violence. And that would be a great project for students in Ukraine and Germany. Pani Larissa, you raised your hand. Microphone, please. We can't hear you. So I know we're wrapping up, but it would be wonderful, really, to have this kind of look into the cultural history of Ukrainian Hunt, who had written the cultural history of the French Revolution. And the history of ideas that functioned in this space of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian territories, and the history of the different practices, the history of violence, and the category of class, and how this category was seen by the different strata of society and how it was used. And so that would be the study that might unite all of this different complexity of this period. Thank you. This is very apropos. And it's also been repeated by Natalia Hanenko-Friesen. So we see this very seriously. Maybe we really should think about a second volume, right? With new questions and new articles about the Ukrainian Revolution. We're almost done. We don't have much time left. If anybody would like to take maybe the last two remarks, I know it's a bit tragic, but you understand what's saying. If anybody would like to briefly add anything in our discussion to wrap things up, is there anybody? I don't see hands. It would probably be good to have another discussion for this issue, but we're running out of time. Then I would like to thank everybody for participating in this discussion. I would like to thank most of all Oksana Dudko. She deserves our applause. She deserves our accolades. This wouldn't have happened without her. Thank you, Oksana. This is your issue, your achievement, and your holiday. I would like to say that we will continue this seminar. It will continue every month, likely in the last Thursday or Friday of every month. We are putting together a plan, an agenda with Ola Hnatyuk, Mark Stech, and Frank Sisson. The next one will probably be either a discussion of a collection of Olhev Bashkevsky, which Piotr Wróbel had reviewed, or a discussion of the top volumes of Hrushevsky. So thank you all for your participation, and have a wonderful week, with good fruitful work, and I hope to see you in a few weeks. All the best. Thank you again, and see you next time.